By this point, most of you probably already know where the RX 580 stacks up against its current competition, the RX 480, which is also an AMD card, the GTX 1060, and the GTX 1070. And I have to say, based on the benchmarks that you're about to see, the 580 is a compelling offer and an excellent value, especially compared to what we saw from previous generations on both sides of the aisle. So in this video, we're changing things up a bit. We're assuming that you've already seen the slew of benchmarks regarding the RX 580's performance and standard resolutions, and that's why in this benchmarking video, you'll see 1080p ultra-wide as the resolution of choice, which is a 21:9 format, versus the standard 16:9 aspect ratio with 1080p, 1440p, 4K, etc. On top of that, we'll be using an R7 1700X Ryzen CPU clocked at 3.8 GHz paired with 16 GB of 2666 MHz DDR4. Now, as for the two graphics cards, I've decided to give the RX 480 as much of a disadvantage as possible in terms of overclocking potential, just because in this case it is a blower style card, whereas the RX 580 is just a third-party custom cooled card from Gigabyte's Aorus gaming lineup. And I have to say, this card is absolutely beautiful. If there is one thing that I have to critique about it though, it's that it's so large. It's actually like a 2.5, 3 slot card if you really want to get technical with it. It's not a thin card by any means, it's also not very light. So build quality is excellent, it's an excellent design thermally. It can actually dissipate quite a bit of heat coming from the RX 580, which actually has a higher TDP than the standard RX 480, but at the same time, you expect that. It's a more powerful version of the Polaris architecture. Now, with that, I do want to say one more thing. These are out of the box, just clock frequencies here. I haven't tinkered with any memory frequencies or GPU frequencies, so you can look these up. They're linked in the video description. You can also find both of these cards if you're interested in purchasing one or the other. So let's start first with GTA 5. I always start with this benchmark because it is so well optimized. It leverages both CPU and GPU horsepower very well and very fair. Now, the first graph you're going to see here is the frame time graph. A little context here, what this is showing is the amount of time that it takes for each graphics card to render every single frame over the course of the benchmark. Now, this may seem a bit counterintuitive because when it comes to FPS, we want the highest number, right? Well, frame times is essentially that fraction flipped upside down. Instead of frames per second, it's seconds per frame. And in this case, you want the lowest number possible, which means that it doesn't require your card very much time to render each subsequent frame. Now, in the case of the RX 580, it spends a majority of its time rendering frames faster than its 480 counterpart. Though around the 5,000th frame, both cards definitely stuttered a bit. The 580 had a little bit more trouble, it seems, that very exceptional spike there in the middle, and this would actually be noticeable in real life. You would see literal stuttering in these cases just because it's basically a pause in the graphics card's ability to render frames, and that's why you see those sharp spikes. For the most part, though, the trend you're looking for is a very flat and consistent line that stays well below, I would say, 25 to 30 milliseconds. Now, this graph's counterpart, which I'm sure you've seen quite a bit, the average and minimum frame rates for both cards, the RX 580 maintained 89.8 FPS, almost 90 FPS at very high settings with no AA and no advanced graphics, signifying a 6.2% increase of performance in general over the RX 480 counterpart when we look at the averages. Next up on our list is Witcher 3. Now, this is a very graphics intensive game. It's why I still use this benchmark. It's not going to be picky about the CPU per se, as long as it's not something like a dual core from 2004. If it's a quad core and it's semi-modern, you should be okay on the CPU side. The graphics card will be leveraged heavily in this case. Now, for the frame time graph here, everything looks hunky-dory except for those very sharp spikes. Both the 480 and the 580 experienced these, by the way, and at similar times, interestingly enough. The 160 millisecond delay is definitely noticeable. It occurs 2 or 3 times for both cards. This is a severe stutter issue, and that would be probably the result of the Ultra preset. In this case, I recommend lowering the settings, even though the 580 and the 480 did very well. This is something that could be solved by lowering in-game settings. Nonetheless, average and minimum frame rates are acceptable for both cards. The RX 580 pulls ahead by 13.34% on average, and that's due to the fact that Witcher 3 is so graphics intensive. Any small change in GPU horsepower will be amplified by a game like this. Now, let's take a U-turn and look at a game that's very CPU intensive, in this case, City Skylines. Here we see the RX 580 pulling ahead up front, and this is where in the benchmark I was zoomed far out from the city. Now when I zoomed way into the city, CPU intensiveness increases, and that is why the difference between the two cards later on in the benchmark becomes very obscure. At this point, the graphics card isn't being leveraged very much at all, and that is why the frame rates are fairly consistent. The story continues with average and minimum frame rates. The RX 580 received a 6% increase over the 480 on average, though it did dip slightly lower on the minimum side. This is probably within the margin of error though, and remember, because it's a CPU intensive, the 1700X or CPU will be leveraged more in this case. If we switch the CPU to something that has a slightly higher IPC, say a 7700K at 5 GHz, then we could expect a larger increase in frame rate than we do from the 480 to the 580. Lastly, I wanted to benchmark a DirectX 12 title that is optimized for both AMD CPUs and GPUs, so best case scenario here for ATLYSS of the Singularity. I don't know anyone who just plays ATLYSS. Do any of you play ATLYSS? I just benchmark with it. That's pretty much all it is to me. It's just a benchmark. Across the board here, the RX 580 rendered about 10% more frames per second than the RX 480. There's really nothing else to say here. This is just a benchmark showing the difference in graphics potential with a GPU intensive benchmark. Now I want to end this video on a very brief and cool note for AMD. By this point you might be wondering, why on earth the 580 even exists if the 480 was doing just fine in the current market? In fact, in some cases it was even outperforming the 1060 while at the same time costing less than the 1060, which means that not only do you get the better value, which has been AMD's strong suit since whenever, but you also get the better performer. In a few cases, not all cases, but still worth considering. That's why I prefer the RX 480 over the 1060, just as a general consumer. But what the 580 does is bring you that extra 5 to 15% performance increase. It depends on the game, whether it's CPU or GPU intensive and whether it's AMD optimized or not, for almost the same price as the 400 series lineup. That is super cool of AMD. I can see it now, NVIDIA releasing the 1060 Ti and then tacking on a $75 premium. That's standard operating procedure, admit it, Green Team, so I'm very surprised that AMD hasn't decided to go that route. They've improved their architecture and for the most case are not charging a penny more for it. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, thumbs down for the opposite, click the subscribe button if you haven't already. Stay tuned for more content like this on the channel. This is Salazar Studio. Thanks for learning with this.